I will present you the INRA system, which is a fairly recent system. As you know, we have written two books, two red books. One is in English. You have this book. It is fairly thick, but I can advise you to read it, but not in one day because it is fairly thick. And this morning I will just present you a brief summary of what is important to keep in mind when you want to use this system. First of all, I will recall briefly the story of the recent system at INRA. In 1978, when Robert was a student, we have published the first red book, Alimentation des ruminants, and after 10 years, we have published an updating of this book here. And after we had to spend about 20 years to have an updating of our systems. Between these both systems, we had a publication of tables of multi-species with several translations in English, in Spanish, and in Chinese. The major target that we have in this Systali project, the name of the project was Systali, is to try to be more precise in the prediction of supplies of energy and protein first. I recall you that for energy, we use a net energy system for milk or for meat, which is packaged in a feed unit system. And also we use a system of metabolizable protein, which is called PDI. And we also have included in our system digestible amino acid in the intestine. We wanted also to be able to try to predict the flows of absorbable nutrients, VFA, glucose, fatty acid, amino acid, obviously, and also production of gas like methane. We wanted also to be more precise in the prediction of the requirements and also mainly in the prediction of the responses to UFL, to PDI, or to nutrients such as concentrate. And also we would like to be able to enlarge the field of application because we knew that our system was not accurate when we wanted to use it in the context of warm countries, for instance, or also in the context of very intensive diets. This is a team of Systali. My fellow colleagues, Pierre Nozière is here. And this morning I will review rapidly and briefly 17 major novelties that we have proposed in this book, and I will stress only some of these novelties. The first one concerns the data creation and statistical treatments. To be able to update our feed unit system, we have first pulled databases, about 20 databases from data of the literature, and after that we have applied specific encoding of the experiment, of the type of experiment, the objective, etc., etc. After that we did treatments by meta-analysis, and the outcome of that is a core of about 500 equations, which is for us the skeleton of our system. The second novelty is about the transit fractional outflow rate, because until now we use a constant value of 6% per hour, and we knew that it was in fact false. This is the reason why we have first tried to improve our modeling of this aspect by taking into account the type of feed, forage versus concentrate, the liquid phase, and also the factors such as the dry matter intake and the proportion of concentrate. Here you have, for instance, the equations that we use to predict the transit outflow rate for concentrate, forage. The value of 6% per hour is here. That means that, for instance, in our new system, the fractional outflow rate of particle is less than 6%, except for high level of dry matter intake. Okay? And we also have a negative influence of the proportion of concentrate on these fractional outflow rates. A major consequence of that is that from now, the nutritive values of feeds in the table is only an indicative value. I will go back on this aspect after. We have used the result of the transit fractional outflow rate in combination with in situ kinetics of protein and starch, as it was already done in several other systems, such as the Cornell one. We have used this equation, which is a classical one, and with all this equation, we have tried to predict the duodenal flow from experimental data and also from in situ data. This is, for example, the results that we have obtained for protein. The y-axis is the in vivo duodenal protein flow, and the x-axis is the predicted flow from the in situ and the kinetics of particle outflow rate in function of the dry matter intake and proportion of concentrate. And interestingly, the slope that we have is not different from one, and we were able to find here on the intercept an estimation of the endogenous protein outflowing at this level, at the duodenum of the animal. So that means that we have a prediction without bias of this flow of protein at the duodenum level, which is for us very important. We did the same thing for starch. And also, fortunately for starch, we obtained a slope of 1 with no intercept here, which is fairly logical. That means that now we are able also to predict not only the partition of protein digestion in the gut, but also the partition of starch digestion in the gut. I have mentioned before the fact that now the nutritive value of feeds is variable. For instance, here, if we consider the bypass metabolizable protein, which is called PDIA in French, you have here the values. Here you have the values that we had in the previous system, okay? Now, here you have the values that we have in the new system. We have a systematic decrease of the bypass value for the feed rich in protein, which is logical because we have decreased the outflow rate from the rumen, okay? But this is a tabulated value. If you use a diet with a higher level of dry matter intake, you will have another value. If you use a diet with a lower level of dry matter intake, you will have another value. That means that from now, the values, the nutritive values that you have in the tables for protein are variable according to the type of diet. This is the same thing for energy. For instance, here you have the UFL value of the previous system, and here you have the difference between the new system and the older one. For this type of feed, for instance, here, 1 UF in the previous system, now a little bit more in the table, but if you give this feed with a higher level of dry matter intake, 3, and a proportion of concentrate of 0.2, you will have a lower value. And if you use it in a more intense ration, you will have still a lower value. And if you use this feed in a ration with a level of dry matter intake of 4% of the body weight, you will have still a lower value. This is important to keep that in mind, that now we have variable nutritive value for the feeds. The novelty number 4, which is a very important one for us, is an index that we use to try to assess the nutrition of microbes, particularly the protein energy ratio and also the exchanges of ammonia and urea through the wall of the rumen. This index is called Rumen Protein balance, and this is correlated with the transfer of ammonia and urea through the rumen wall. And a particularity is that we have used this item to predict some nutritive aspect, digestive protein efficiency, urinary nitrogen excretion, digestive integration, microbial synthesis, etc. Just to show you briefly with some figure what we have done, here you have a view of the rumen with the microbes, the energy part, the protein part here, the degradation, the bypass of protein, and here you have the exchanges of ammonia and urea by recycling here. And until now, we were not satisfied by the way we have used to model this aspect. So this is the reason why we have created the rumen protein balance, which is the difference between crude protein intake and crude protein at the duodenum. That means that, for instance, if you have a positive value of that, you have an outflow of ammonia from the rumen. And if we look at the relationship that we have, for instance, between the rumen protein balance and the ammonia in the rumen, there is logically a positive relationship. Same thing for urea N in the blood or also in the milk. And another outcome of that is that the efficiency of protein digestion, which is the ratio between metabolizable protein to crude protein, is heavily influenced by the rumen protein balance, with a value of 67 for the value of 0 here. We can say that it is a pivot. At this level, we have this level of digestibility, but you see that we have a large decrease of the efficiency of digestion of protein when you increase the rumen protein balance. And also, and logically, when you increase the rumen protein balance expressed in nitrogen intake per kilogram of body weight, clearly you have an increase of the excretion of urinary N. And if you look at the slope of this relationship, the slope is between 50 to 80% of nitrogen coming directly from the rumen to the urinary excretion flow, which is fairly important. A consequence of that is that there is a close intra-experiment relationship between the rumen protein balance and the global protein efficiency of a dairy cow. Global protein efficiency is milk protein in percentage of protein intake. If we are at 0 here, we are about close to 30%, but you can have a large decrease of this global efficiency when you increase the rumen protein balance. And this is the contrary if we decrease the rumen protein balance. The novelty number 5 is also for us a very important one. You see here there is a star. This is the issue of the digestive interactions. As you know, the value of a diet is not exactly the weighted sum of the values of the feed, because there is terms of interaction, and for us the target was to be able to model this interaction. We have chosen to measure the interaction at the level of the organic matter digestibility, and we have checked several potential factors which could explain these digestive interactions. At the end, we have found that 3 major feed factors could have a significant influence: the feeding level here, the proportion of concentrate, and the rumen protein balance that I have evoked just before. To be able to model the influences of these 3 parameters, we have built specific databases dealing only on the effect of dry matter intake, for instance here, dealing only on the effect of percentage of concentrate and the effect of rumen protein balance. You can see that, for instance, when you increase the proportion of concentrate, the true values are less than the predicted value from the tables. This is the contrary for high values of rumen protein balance, for instance. We have checked that these 3 effects were additive. It was an important issue for us. The outcome of that is that if we consider that the impact of digestive interaction can be considered as a non-productive requirement, you see that we have behind that hundreds of experiments. You have here the milk yield. 1 point is 1 group of animals. You have the maintenance requirements in terms of energy. And here you have the maintenance requirements plus the non-productive requirements due to the digestive interaction. And you can see that in this part, with very high yielding animals, this part is about the same than the maintenance requirements of the animal, which is not at all negligible. After that, another novelty was the prediction of the methane production. And the major problem that we had for that is that the methane production is not a linear function of the feeding level and of the proportion of concentrate in the diet. So we have to use this type of equation in the computer program that we have to formulate the diets. And also we have updated the values that we had to try to quantify the loss of energy through the urine outflow. And we also had to check the relationship that we can have between the loss of energy by methane and urinary energy and the loss of energy from the fecal way when we are in a context of digestive interaction. Here you have diets which were only focused on the influence of the feeding level. And clearly you can see that if you increase from 1 point the fecal energy, you decrease from 0.5 points this outflow of energy. There is clearly a compensation between the both. And for us, it is very important to be able also to take this compensation into account. Because, for instance, if we compare several systems in terms of the impact of the digestive interactions on the net energy value, according to the milk yield, our system is here. The Finnish system is also at the same level. They have done a different approach, but with the same factors of variation. And here you can see the old NIRC system with a higher value of the impact of the digestive interaction, mainly due to the fact that they use a constant ratio between net energy and TDN. With a constant ratio, you are not able to tackle these substitutions that we have between the 2 losses of energy between feces and urine plus methane. But it was the old system. I presume that in the next system of NIRC they will correct that. Novelty number 7, just to be able to calculate the fermentable organic matter in the rumen. It was for us important to do that, to be able to predict the microbial and the Wi-Fi production in the rumen. We have used this equation, it is in the book, and an important consequence of that for us is that, for instance, if we consider our tables in terms of the PDI value of concentrate and byproducts, you can see that here you have the PDI value coming from microbes, and here's the PDI value coming from the bypass protein. That means that clearly the range of variation between feeds is very narrow for the microbes. And if you want to have a very high level of metabolizable protein in a feed, you have to increase this PDI fraction, which is the PDI fraction coming from the bypass. And if we look at the context of feeding a dairy cow, for instance, here you can see that beyond a certain level of PDI intake, if you want to increase more the supply of PDI, you are obliged to use bypass protein. And the outcome of that is that you have to be more aware on the issues of the profile of amino acids. And clearly you see that there is a maximum of capacity of the rumen to produce microbial protein. This view, which was published in a paper in Journal of Dairy Science, is for us very important in terms of applications. The prediction of the flows of absorbable nutrients, I will go quickly through that: PDI, VFI, glucose, fatty acid, and also the profiles of amino acid, of VFA, and also of fatty acids. The following novelty, number 10, I will pass also quickly, is the evaluation of the risk of acidosis. We have based this evaluation on 8 parameters, which are more or less linked with rumen acidosis. The following novelty is dealing with the fact that we had, as I said before, 100 of equations. For instance, we have globally 100 of equations dealing with what happened in the gut. And first of all, we had to check the consistency of all these equations. We have checked that with a mechanistic model of the rumen and also of the gut. And if we focus only on the equation that we use to predict the energy and the protein value of the diet, here you have about 50 equations, and all these equations were packaged into a software which is called SysToolWeb, which allowed to calculate diets according to the ingredients, the level of intake, the proportion of concentrate, and the rumen protein balance. And after that, all that was also packaged further in a global computer program which is called InRation, which will be available at the end of this year or at the beginning of the next year. Some words on the following novelty, which is the evaluation of the maintenance on non-productive protein requirements. For us, it was a new aspect. For instance, particularly at the level of the metabolic fecal protein. We have used an equation which clearly shows that when we decrease the energy content of a diet, we increase the outflow of metabolizable fecal protein per kilogram of dry matter of this feed. That means that if we compare the previous system and the present system, for instance, for this type of animal with a fairly high level of milk yield, we have an increase of more than 500 grams of requirements due to the non-productive requirements. But by this way, we are not very original, because if we compare our situation to the other system, before we were there and we were wrong. Now we are here and we are in the group. Here you have the other European system, here you have the CNCPS, and here you have the NRC, we are now at the same level of the taking into account the metabolic fecal aspect. Another important novelty for us was the efficiency of PDI, because until now we use a constant value which was 64%. Now we have used a new approach. I don't have time to describe, but the basic assumption that we did is that we had variation of the efficiency of the PDI, and these variations are the same for all the post of proteosynthesis in the animal. I mean, for milk, for Scurf, for body protein, and for fecal endogenous protein. And by this way, we obtain relationships between the PDI content and the protein efficiency. This is the equation that we have for dairy cows, with exactly the same equation for the dairy goats. For growing animals, we have also such equations, but with a pivot which is at the level of 50%, which is different from here. We are at the level of 67%. And what seems to us important is that we have a clear relationship between the efficiency of the PDI and the global efficiency of the dairy cow. There is a positive relationship between the both, showing that when we increase this efficiency, we increase the global efficiency of the animal. And what seems for me important to stress is that we have to do distinction between the mean efficiency and the marginal efficiency. Here you have a set of data with the supply of metabolizable protein here, the pivot value for this animal. Here you have the curve of the efficiency of PDI. Here you have the simultaneous response of milk protein yield. And here the simultaneous response of the urinary loss of nitrogen expressed on the protein basis to have a common scale here. And you see that when we are at the pivot values, I mean a mean efficiency of 67%, the marginal efficiency, the slope here, is only 0.2. And here the marginal efficiency is 0.8, showing that when we are at this level of the pivot, we have, if we want to change the level of supply of PDI, we have to keep in mind that the marginal efficiency is fairly low, only 20%. That means that the rest of the variation is recovered at the level of urinary nitrogen. So we were able now to predict fairly precisely the loss of nitrogen through urine, with the possibility of doing a distinction between this loss coming from the PDI inefficiency, which means a drawback in the metabolization of protein, and coming from the Rumen protein balance, which is a drawback of the use of nitrogen at the level of the rumen. So we are able now to do a differential diagnosis of nutrition in ruminant by this way. I will go quickly through this novelty, which is dealing with energy. We did some new things, but I don't have time. The following novelty is the taking into account and the modeling of the mobilization and accretion of body reserves at the potential. For us, it was important to take that into account, to take into account that at the beginning of lactation, the reserve behaves as a supply of energy, and on the contrary, in the following phase of the lactation, the reserve act as a requirement, obligatory requirement. And that means that now, when we want to formulate a diet, we based the first approach on potential trajectories of milk yield, of milk content of fat and protein, and also on the status of the body reserves. We take that into account within the calculation of the diet. The last novelty is dealing with multiple responses to supplies. I will focus on the example of the concentrate supply. First of all, I had to use that to predict the response in terms of dry matter intake. So we use this type of relationship, and now we have taken into account the influence of protein on the capacity of intake of the animal and also on the substitution. And by this way, it is possible for us when we are at the pivot is the potential. That means that you cut the potential trajectory at one time. You have the pivot value here. And for instance, if you modify the supply of concentrate, you have modification, alteration of the lactose secretion, lipid secretion, and proteins secretion. Same thing between goats and cows. And also, we are able to predict the response of protein production, not only from concentrate, but also from supplies of PDI and energy. Here you have the laws that we use, the law of the response that we use, and the pivot situation is here. It is important now to consider that we start from a pivot situation to predict the responses of animals. Same thing here, if you want to predict the milk yield, the milk fat production, milk protein production, and milk lactose production, these equations are also in the Red Book. And also, the last and not the least, for the amino acids, we consider that the amino acid, indispensable amino acids such as lysine and methionine can be limiting factors. It's not new. And we consider that the response to this amino acid is mainly at the level of the milk protein content. And we use a combination, for instance here, of lysine and methionine to predict a simultaneous response of the milk protein content to these two levels of supplies, starting also from the pivot value, which is the requirements, the covering of the requirements of the animal. What I would like to stress as a conclusion is that we have tried to do a deep updating. It was necessary if we wanted to do a new scientifically based system. We have seen a set of novelties here, 17 novelties. They allow to take into account some new aspect of biology, underlying biology. We are able now to increase the precision of our system, which is for us very important. We have checked the consistency of all the equations that we have used. And also we have tried to have prediction of the absorbable nutrients flows in the gut. But I have also to stress the fact that the price of a better precision is an increase of the level of complexity of this system, which is more or less compensated thanks to the computer program. Thank you very much for this attention.